right, Randy Rarick, welcome to the Boardroom Podcast. Good morning. It's good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, good morning, Scott. It's a beautiful day here in North Shore at Sunset Beach. Unfortunately, it's flat, but we're supposed to get a little bump in the north tomorrow, so hopefully some waves.
Right on, man. You're like a stoked grommet. Every time I talk to you, it's like, what are the waves like?
Well, that's why I live where I live and why I do what I do. So nothing wrong with that.
You know what? I love it. It's inspiring. Tell me a little bit, if you will. I want you to harken back to 1962 and your spot, Toes Reef. Tell me a little bit about Toes Reef. I understand you told Jerry Lopez to go left.
Well, on the southeast shore of Oahu, there's a variety of breaks along there. There's Aina, Niu Valley, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, and then you get out to Hawaii Kai. So back in the 60s, hardly anybody surfed out there because it was just the beginning of suburbia in Honolulu. And most of the guys would surf Waikiki or Alamana or this and that. And where I actually lived was right on the beach in front of what is now called Toes. And we used to have to walk down to Aina, which was about a quarter mile away, because that was the only surf spot that anybody was riding then. And I looked out in front one day and it was high tide. And I said, I think we could actually surf out there because at low tide, the coral head's all stuck up. And at high tide, we paddled out and it was rideable. And we went, oh my gosh, we don't have to walk a quarter mile. We can surf right out in front of our house. And Jerry lived up in Niu Valley right behind where I lived. And that was a pretty hotbed of talent back then. Dennis Pang lived up there. Mark Cunningham lived in Niu Valley. Mark Fu was our paper boy back in those days. And anyway, so it was a spot that we just discovered. It was out in front of my house, and the guys actually wanted to call it Rarick's, Reef or something like that. I said, that was too vain. I'm not going to do that. And my friend ran up and he got hung five. And back then in Surfer Magazine had a toes on the nose section. I went, oh, you got toes, you got toes. And we went, toes, we'll call it Toes. And the name stuck. And it's still called that to this day. And like I said, Jerry and his brother Victor used to come out surfing and kind of a slow lower left and a hollower right. And I said, well, Jerry, you got to go left because we're only going to go right. So I think that was his training grounds for his days at Pipeline for sure.
That's classic. Good stuff. Well, look, you know, how long have you been surfing now?
I learned to surf when I was 10 years old, which was like late 59, early 60. I was taught by famous beach boy Rabbit 𝗥𝗏𝗏𝗏. He pushed me in my first wave in Waikiki. And between 10 and 11, I didn't surf that much because we lived up in 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, which was a long trek down to the beach. And then we moved down to the water when I was 12, and that's when I really took up surfing. So I've been surfing for, oh gosh, well, it's 65 years because I'm just about 75 now. So been
Wow.
a lot of waves under the belt.
That's so great. And you're still frothing for tomorrow's swell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Well, look, we've got a lot going on here in Southern California. We've got the Boardroom show coming up and
Mhm.
we're honoring 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗏. Are you coming out for that?
I'm trying to get organized. My wife's got another thing going on that same weekend, so I'm seeing if I can do a little shuffle and jive. But I hope to make. I told Bob I would be out there. I actually visited Bob earlier this year, back in March, and I was really stoked that you picked him to be the honoree because he's well deserving. And I've known Bob since he first came to Hawaii, and he worked for me when I had the Weber dealership in '69. He actually slept in the shaping room floor, and he was completely broke, and he was trying to get enough money to get back to Australia. So I put him to work just kind of during the transition era in '69,
Yeah.
and he built what he called the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 which were sort of a kind of a cross between high performance shortboard of the early era for sure. So I'd love to come. It'd be fun, and I'll know in the next couple of weeks if I'm going to be there, and if so, I'll be glad to sit there with you, and we'll pay tribute to 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 for sure.
Yeah, it'll be good. We have 8 shapers that are honoring Bob by competing in the shape off, and it's gonna be interesting. I ran into a bullet the other day. Somebody sent me Matt Kivlin sent me a picture of a bullet that he owns,
Uh-huh.
𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 bullet, and I was like, yeah, those, you know what, interesting boards, and yeah, that's how he kind of made his money to get back to Australia by building a few bullets.
Exactly. Well, a lot of people know the story behind 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. He came here in '67 to compete in a Duke event. And I actually was working for Fred Van Dyke as kind of a runner for the event. I was 17 years old at the time. And so he sent me into the airport to pick up Bob. And, I'm going, oh my gosh, Bob McTavish. And I picked him up at the airport and he was a classic guy. And we got the V bottom and brought it back out to North Shore. And it's kind of history. He went out at the Duke meet and spun out at sunset. But really, that to me was the first shot over the bow for the shortboard revolution. I mean, that board was actually a 9.2. Wasn't that short. And he had put a pointed nose on it, but still had the super wide V tail that they were using in Australia. And the board really, didn't work very well in Hawaii, although he and Nat went over and made him work over at Honolulu and got some good footage on that. But you only see the ones that they made. You don't see how many they spun out on and how many they ate it on. But so I've known Bob for 60 years now, and he came back and worked for 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗶𝗴 and did the McTavish tracker. And then actually it's interesting because by the time the tracker came out, that in his mind was an obsolete design already. But Maury went on and make a couple thousand of them. And then Bob came here to Hawaii right after that, and the boards were getting shorter and shorter. And so the 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗶𝗆 was his design of progressive. It was right before the low rails came in, so it was late '69, and that winter of '69, that's when Hinson sort of introduced the breakaway rail that Jerry and the rest of the guys sort of adapted, and McTavish picked up on it as well. So really interesting design time of evolution in the surfboards for sure.
Yeah, on Instagram just this morning, I saw a little thing of Wayne Lynch. Can he just happened to have three of his boards from sort of that 67, 68, 69 era. And he was going through them and he was basically saying what you're saying, which was, hey man, by the time this board, I figured it out, I was already over it. And we're talking probably 5 weeks, but by the time the surfing public picked up on it, he was already on board number 4.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll give you an example. I graduated from high school in '67, and in early '68, it was January '68, I booked a trip to Australia. I wanted to go down and see what was going on. So I had a 9.6 Weber stylus pintail and an 8.10 Weber feather because I was a Dewey Weber team rider at that time. I put him on this P&O liner. It took 2 weeks to get from Hawaii to Australia. I got off in Sydney, and by the time I got off the boat in Sydney, both my boards were completely obsolete. The guys in Australia were already down to 8-foot boards, and I got picked up by this famous kind of patriarch of Australian surfing, 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀. Stayed in Manly, and I met Midget, I met Nat, I met Wayne Lynch, and I became really good friends during the '68 Australian titles. His mom used to drop him off at the apartment where I lived. He and Keith Paul and myself would go surfing together, and I kind of coached both Wayne and Keith, and Keith ended up winning the men's title, and Wayne won the junior title. But as Wayne said, he was the phenom back then. He was 16 years old, and I was 18, and it was a really fun time. That's how I've got such good connections with all those guys.
Yeah, it's what I've often said, 6 degrees of separation. Randy Rarick seems to have been somewhere when something important happened. I mean, I understand you were around when Napoleon had his famous charge.
Yeah, it's funny. My life is at a really early age, I made a decision. I wanted to be a surfer, and that was it. And I said, I'm going to do anything and everything surf. And so I really dedicated the last 65 years of my life. And I've pretty much done everything. I've showed surf movies. I run the Triple Crown. I've shaped surfboards. I've patched a zillion boards. I've traveled through 70 different countries and surfed in all of them, and been around the world and seen everybody. And it's been really a great life. And I'm still going. So still
Yeah.
stoked.
No, I love that. And that, like I said, it's inspiring for me. And I'm stoked to see you still frothing like a Grom. Um, you know, I was talking to Bob Campy actually about his Brewer movie called The Shape of Things.
Uh-huh.
And he and I started talking about McTavish and Brewer and the shortboard revolution and this and that. And I'm of the opinion, and my opinions need to be guided. So help me out here. I'm of the opinion that we had 2 separate tracks. It wasn't like a race to see who could make the shortboard first. I felt like 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗃 was all about Greeno just standing in one spot on the board, turning off of that spot, not having to move forward to get forward momentum. And Brewer was more like, look, we're in Hawaii. We're going to have long rail anyway. We're going to have a long rail line regardless. I mean, we're surfing Sunset Beach. We're going to have 9 feet of rail. It's not going to be a shortboard. But of course, there's that famous moment when he just kind of got fed up and cut off the tail of Lopez's board. Um, and you know, so I just don't sense that there was this like combative race. It was almost like two different tracks parallel, and no one really knew what the other was doing.
I think you summed it up really good. So what happened was, as I said earlier, he came for the Duke meet, surfed at Sunset Beach, had the V bottom, basically, spun out, but had this different line that he was drawing. And I was on the beach when that happened. I was standing actually next to Dewey Weber, and I remember 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗃 took off, went down to the bottom, laid it on the V. The thing skidded about 2, 3 feet, and then went back up vertical. And it's, there's that movie called Going Vertical that depicts that. And he took that board over to Maui. Well, Brewer was already in Maui. Well, when they got there, everybody was riding 9/6 pintails. So the pintail was happening, and the pintail, as you said earlier, was perfect for Hawaiian lines, especially like at Honolulu. It drew really good lines. And then they saw the V bottom working, and they saw the neat things it did, where it did that, really radical on the panel, but it had such a wide tail. So that's where you're right. Brewer was doing his thing, but he wasn't really getting short yet. And then he had made for Gary Chapman an 8/6 pintail. So that was considered a foot shorter. And so he was beginning to go short himself. And the Aussies, had already been making shorter boards, but they brought longer boards for Hawaii because they thought they needed the extra length. And 𝗦𝗵𝗃𝗃 got over there, and sort of him and Brewer, they weren't competing with each other. If anything, they interacted with each other. And what happened, what really became out of that was the V bottom pintail. And people don't really recognize this. Brewer began to incorporate the V into his pintails. And then, of course, he went shorter. And then, as you said, the famous thing where he went in there and he had a 9/6 templated for Jerry. And he sawed the tail off, and all of a sudden it was 8/6, and Jerry freaked out. Well, once he shaped it and got it going, it was it worked. So I think you're right. I think there was parallel tracks, and then Hinson was involved, back in that here in California, and he was really pushing it as well. So I don't think there's any one guy or any one thing. I think it was a conglomeration of, intermixing, and everybody. It was a small world back then too. You got to realize everybody knew everybody, and so they were interacting. I remember when I was working with Greg Knoll over here at the Greg Knoll shop at that time when 𝗦𝗵𝗃𝗃 showed up. Charlie Glenna went in the next day and cut the tail off of his pintail and reshaped a board into what they called the bug. And so really there's all this interplay that was going on amongst all the shapers, and there was a lot of design thing. And you got to realize this is before Instagram or YouTube or anything like that. So it was all personal interaction. So you're right. There was no one guy that you could say did it. Like I said, I think the shot across the bow was by 𝗦𝗵𝗃𝗃 when he showed up. But you think about it, that was 67, and Nat had been riding Sam a year earlier at San Diego. So the thing had been ongoing for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned Charlie Galanto, and I think there's a lot of guys like Charlie that history has a way of sort of boiling down to maybe 2 or 3 guys. And I
Right.
sense that there are guys that maybe weren't as important, but just didn't ever got recognition for their part in the process.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unsung heroes, no question about that. And like I said, I was working at the Greg Knoll shop, and Charlie owned it and ran it. And we had some really good, it's interesting, glassing the boards was Craig Sugihara, who went on to form Town and Country. 𝗦𝗃𝗃𝗃 was shaping in there. He had left Surfboards in 𝗏𝗏𝗃 and was with Greg Knoll at that stage. And so there was all this interaction, and Charlie would load up a board. He had an El Camino. He'd load it up, drive out to the North Shore, pass out the boards, and let guys try. And it was kind of like the early days of what 𝗥_𝗱𝗆𝗆 did later at Lightning Bolt, where you start giving all these boards out to these guys, and you get the feedback coming back, and that interaction between the shaper and the surfers. And back then, what you got to realize is a lot of those guys that were shapers were all really good surfers too. So if you were a surfer shaper, you really could progress design quickly in those days.
And what was your part in all of this? I mean, I know you were shaping surfboards, but were you just at that point, were you just more like ding repair kid, or were you
Yeah,
like,
I hadn't really started shaping that. I started shaping it after I came back from Australia because I learned how to shape really good with 𝗥𝗍𝗆, and then working at the Greg Knoll shop, George Downing taught me, my chops. But really, my shaping career started in the transition era, and but I was a ding king. They called me Super Patch because I patched boards for both Surfline Hawaii and Greg Knoll. And that was what really helped me, is because all these boards would come through the shops and I would end up fixing them. You fix a ding or a nose repair or whatever was wrong with it, broken in half boards. And so literally I fixed tens of thousands of surfboards. And in doing so, I looked at all these shapes, all these designs, all these fin templates. That's why I know so much about surfboards, because I literally worked on tens of thousands of them.
Yeah, that's great training ground, right? So pretty fascinating. Changing subjects a little bit. We've got the California Gold Surf Auction coming up. You are the what's the best way to characterize it? You're the go-to guy for insight on the history of surfboards, and I thought I'd run some boards by you that are in the catalog now and get your insight on them. And the one that a guy called me about yesterday and wanted some insight on was the Buzzy Trent board that's in the auction. It's shaped by Dick Brewer, and Bosco Burns did the laminating. What do you know about this Buzzy Trent? It is his last surfboard, Buzzy Trent's last surfboard.
Well, I'm intimately knowledgeable about that board, and I'll tell you for a couple of reasons. But I'm going to give you a quick little backstory. So people who want to know who Bosco Burns was, well, Bosco started glassing for 𝗏𝗶𝗃 when he was 21 years old, and he was the head glasser at 𝗏𝗶𝗃. And in 1967, Phil Edwards decided to move from California here to Hawaii, and he brought Bosco with him. And he set up and started making Phil Edwards Honolulus, which in my personal opinion are the very best of the longboard era. This is when Phil had reached his zenith. He was in here in Hawaii sailing and surfing and making boards. He made about 500 boards in 67, 68 time period, and transitioned to the shortboard, and Bosco glassed them all. And so Bosco Burns was a really good glasser, had worked for 𝗏𝗶𝗃, so he obviously was good, came to Hawaii, relocated with Phil, and set up and glassed all of Phil's boards. He also glassed a lot of others. And then moving into the 70s, he started glassing boards for like Tom Parrish and a bunch of guys for Lightning Bolt, and continued right up until he passed away about 10 years ago. Bosco was still glassing. So the glass job on that board is phenomenal. And if you look at the pin lines on it, I don't know if it shows up very well in the photos from the auction, but he's got these pin lines that are about 1/32 of an inch thick that are right next to each other. Just beautiful, and a real pale blue tin on that board. Excuse me. And then Buzzy, what had happened is I actually shaped two boards for Buzzy in early 70 as well. And then Brewer, shortboards had started by then. If you look at the shape of the board, it's still got a roll under the nose. It doesn't have down rails yet. It was right about the time that down rails were being made, late 69, early 70, right in that period. And he's got the kind of radical fin on it, real narrow, real high performance, tapered out fin. And Buzzy was trying to make the transition to shorter boards at that time. And he also was into hang gliding. That's when hang gliding was really popular. And what had happened, he was on a hang gliding exhibition, and he lost control, and he ran into a water tank and crashed into the water tank, broke his legs, and he was a construction worker and everything. And he had to stop working. And that was really the end of Buzzy Trent's career, when he ran into this water tank while he was hang gliding. And the board that he'd been riding at that stage was the last Brewer that you've got in the auction. So a lot of provenance, with Bosco Burns glassing it, of course, Dick Brewer shaping it, and Buzzy Trent, probably one of the best big wave riders of all time, his last board. So talk about provenance, that board's got a lot of it.
Tell me a little bit, what do you know about this hang gliding accident? Like, was this somewhere in Hawaii that this occurred?
Yeah, I think it was over on the west side, and he had jumped off up above 𝗏𝗂𝗏𝗀, over by Yokohama, and came down, and a fluke wind, or I'm not sure exactly what happened, but he was coming in low to land, and got blown off course, and he ran into this water tank and smashed into it, and he broke a bunch of bones, and it sort of semi-crippled him, actually. And that was it. That was the end of his career after that.
Oh man, that's horrible. Wow.
Yeah, well, he was still alive, and after that, he kind of basically retired, and he lived out a good life. In fact, he lived just down the street from Toes. That's why I used to see him walking on Kalaniani Highway, and I'd say hi to him every once in a while.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, he's definitely a character, Buzzy Trent, and what a board. Dick Brewer, Buzzy Trent, like you say, tons of provenance. Um, there's a board that you worked on that John Kelly hydro. That's like a beautiful red. Tell me
But
a little bit and tell the listeners a little bit about John Kelly. I think he's a guy that kind of slips through the cracks just a little bit regarding the history of surfing.
I think John was sort of in that a little too early for his time, you might say. He was instrumental with Fran Heath and George Downey in helping to develop the hot curl surfboard in the late 40s, early 50s. And he took the old wide-tailed, plank boards from Waikiki and pulled it in and cut it down and helped, he's credited with creating the hot curl. And that really redefined surfboards in the 60s. And so he was involved in design, and he was a good shaper and a pretty good surfer too. John surfed Waimea, and he was a goofy footer. He loved surfing Yokohama on the west side, and so he developed the hydro. And what the hydro is, has got a flat planing surface in the shape of a pintail that's straight on the bottom, and then this radically kicked tail that you step back on and turn. And his idea was you move forward to get the speed, and you step back on the tail to turn it. And so it's a design like nobody else had ever had before. And it said, and we don't know the exact amount, but it said he made almost up to 200 of these, which I was actually surprised that many were actually made. And we used to see them, and they were such a weird board that they never sold that good. I'm surprised that he made that many of them. And I always remember the classic line of Paul Stroud where he says, trying to ride a hydro is like trying to surf in high heels. And I always thought that was a classic line because the boards went fast, really fast in a straight line. But then when you try to change directions on them, they were really tough. And this one that's in the auction, I did a full restoration on it, but I was inspired by it. This guy got in touch with me from Iowa, of all places, and he had one. He had this one that he sent back. He said, I've had this board for 30, 40 years. And I said, how did you get it to Iowa? And he says, well, somebody brought it from Hawaii or something. I don't know the exact story. So he had it sent back to Hawaii. So I said, well, we might as well make this look really good and just try to replicate exactly like it was. So we basically did a full glass off restoration. It's got the original koa wood fin on it. It's a beautiful fin on the board.
Yeah.
And we replicated the red panels. And I'd never seen a red one. All the other ones I'd see all had kind of a turquoise blue or blue stripes because the logo is blue. And somebody decided to have a red one. So we did it, and it came out gorgeous. And, if you want to have a really unique board, there's an opportunity to get one for sure.
Well, it certainly is, and it really pops, right? The work you did on it's amazing. So well done. Um, moving along, there's a guy that I think I I'd like to know more about for sure. Um and
You're
his
talking
name
about
is Dick. His
Oh,
name is
okay.
𝗥𝗿𝗄𝗃. Dick Catri.
Okay, well, Catri is the
Did you see the board that I'm talking about,
yep,
by the
yeah,
way?
that's a cool
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
Catri is the original hypester from Florida. I mean, I knew Dick back in the 60s. He got invited to I think it was a 67 Duke event representing Florida. Came out, and he was a good big wave rider. Having been from Florida, you wouldn't know that, but he was a big guy, and he surfed Hawaii really good. He got to know Brewer and all the guys out here. He had a Hobie Brewer model. He was the team captain for Surfboards Hawaii, which was a powerhouse team back in the mid 60s. Then he switched to Hobie, teamed up with Gary Proper, helped introduce the GP model for Hobie, and he was really the powerhouse leader of the pack in South Florida. And then he had his own surf shop and with Shags during the shortboard evolution era. So I think this board is around the time they made Catri surfboards. So he went, through the Florida manufacturers, then teamed up with, like I said, Surfboards Hawaii, then teamed up with Hobie, and made the transition through to shortboards, and then kept going. And he inspired and coached and really was a moving factor in Southern Florida. And I think, Hall of Famer without a doubt. So it's kind of cool that you got one of his boards, and it kind of represents that era of the early mid 70s. And I think the fact that it's representing the East Coast, that's kind of neat that you found one that clean.
It's in such good shape. When I saw it, I was like, oh my God, it's got this beautiful airbrush on it. And like you said, it's really clean. It's a cool board. And like, I'm always trying to kind of spread our wings a little bit regarding the offering, and sometimes that means bringing in boards that might not be the highest value, but in my opinion, these shapers, these board builders need to be recognized. So sometimes I bring in some of these, I don't know the best way to phrase it, but just, not the like premium brewers, you know what I mean?
No, no, but it's good to have regional labels because that shows that all around the world, just like we talked a little earlier about the cross-pollination of ideas between guys like Brewer and 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗀, well, the East Coast, was a hotbed of talent, and you can't disregard that area. So to bring a couple of regional labels in from the East Coast is really neat. I think the fact that you're acknowledging Bob 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗀's from Australia, that's really cool because it's not all about Americans or all about Hawaiians. It's a global sport, and these guys had influences around the world. So to have offerings from different areas, especially I deal with a lot of collectors, obviously, in my restoration projects, and there's a lot of East Coast collectors. I think you should go next time, find something like a 𝗥ส์𝗱𝗆𝗄𝗂 from New York or something up in the Northeast label, and next auction, throw something like that in there. It'd be really cool since you got South Florida represented now. And I even think what would be really cool is if you could find a great board that was made in Texas.
Wow.
People don't acknowledge the Gulf Coast, but the Gulf Coast was really, really stoked. Not the best surf, that's for sure. But I'll tell you, those guys were keen back in the day when surfing was booming.
Or even maybe like a 𝗫𝗫𝗄𝗃. That's the name that popped into my mind.
Oh yeah, 𝗫𝗫𝗄𝗃 from Pensacola, that would be another one. So
Yeah.
those regional labels, those guys were heroes in the area, and you've got a good representation with 𝗥_Catri. So something to think about for the future, Scott.
Yeah, for sure. And in that sort of vein, I have this JoJo Perrin board, which I found, and you know, I don't know if you know much about JoJo Perrin. I didn't know much about JoJo, but I learned a little bit as I was, doing some research on this board. It's just a beautiful stiletto, slick, lime green board that caught my attention because it's just a beastie gun.
Well, come on, Scott. I'm the Forrest Gump of surfing, so I know
Yes.
I know JoJo super well.
Oh, good.
We were both on the Dewey Weber team back in the 60s, and Dewey brought JoJo over for one of the trips to Hawaii. I think it was 66, maybe 67. And so JoJo and I surfed really a lot together. And then I had the Dewey Weber dealership here in 1969, and then I let the dealership go, and Dewey sent JoJo over. So JoJo took over the Weber dealership for me, and he lived in Kailua. And what people don't realize is, besides being a really good surfer, he made the transitions to shortboards really well, and because he was young enough. A lot of the older guys just didn't do that. And he started designing his own boards, and he was a really, really good artist. And a funny little story, he lived in Kailua, and he painted this wall, kind of like a little bit Rick Griffin-ish type of cartoon characters with waves and stuff on the wall. And when he moved out of the apartment, he cut the wall out and took the wall with him because the artwork was so good. And the landlord was so pissed off at him for cutting this giant hole in the wall. But anyway, JoJo was a really good surfer, became a really good shaper, got caught up in the lifestyle of the air. The definitely psychedelics took its toll on JoJo, and it showed in his shapes and in his artwork. And his shaping was kind of really radical at times. He was making things that were really spacey. I mean, they represented, I think, where his head was at the time, and his artwork. And I think the board that you got is a good example of that, where you see a really good shape that's pretty stiletto and speary, as you said, and then he's got a hand-drawn logo that he did himself on that one. So once again, a unique piece of surf history, and for somebody who wants something a little bit different and out of the norm, at least you got that on offer. That's great.
Yeah, that's kind of the hope, that we showcase, and that we offer something that's also approachable for a collector such as myself, who doesn't necessarily have $10,000, but I might have $800 or $1,500. Tell me about what I think is a pretty spectacular board. I mean, there's quite a few nice offerings here, but we've got this Kivlin balsa. Matt Kivlin made this board for the 2004 20th anniversary Surfrider Foundation auction. It was a big deal. They had it at one of the Hollywood studios. You might have been there. It was quite an ordeal. What do you know about Kivlin? How many of these are around? I've done some research, and apparently this is one of the only boards he's ever made since he stopped shaping in 1960.
Yeah, I remember that was a fundraiser, and I think it went for an extraordinary amount of money at the time. I can't remember the exact price, but being a fundraiser, you got guys that got big bucks, and the people that were there were a lot of surf aficionados who recognized what Kivlin's contribution to the design world has been. So it's not an old one, made from back in the 50s, but it is a Kivlin, and it's recognized. And Kivlin was kind of the unsung hero along with 𝗏𝗏 of the guys who introduced the Malibu chip surfboard. And, they were coming out of the shadow of
Bob, maybe
Bob,
Siemens a
yeah,
little bit, and Velzy a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah. And I don't think they got the accolades that they deserve because they were from up in Malibu. All the media was down in Orange County. And when they were working for Bob, there was a big fight between 𝗏𝗏 and Bob about rocker and this and that. And Kivlin and 𝗏𝗏 sort of broke away and did their own thing in the early 50s. And, the rest is history. I mean, you talk about the girls' boards that 𝗏𝗏 designed that the guys picked up on and realized it worked so good. And same with Kivlin, surfing Malibu, they made boards that worked. And that was the
Yeah.
difference. Bob's boards went straight and went really good for that conditions, but these guys were designing boards that really set the pace for modern surfing. So anytime you can get your hands on a Kivlin, it's definitely worth, the money it's going to bring for sure.
I mean, how many Kivlins have you seen in the space? You've been in this space for, whatever it is, 3 decades in the vintage collecting space. How many Kivlins have you seen? Do you know of?
Probably a dozen, if
Yeah.
that. I mean, he didn't, he wasn't production shaping or anything. He was just making boards because he liked it. He wanted to, became an architect. And so, he had the talent to do it. And they're just, it was balsa and it was pre-foam. So there wasn't that many made. And I've seen probably about a dozen Kivlins and all of them have been really beautiful boards and are really well shaped. And a lot of them, unfortunately, had fallen in major disrepair because they're balsa and they just rotted away. But I think it's kind of like, an artist who becomes very famous, his early work is what you really want to see where he's come from. So I couldn't say anything more about Kivlin other than, he's definitely one of the pioneers of our sport and worthy of collecting for sure.
Yeah, yeah. There's a board that you may have seen, and it's in Carlsbad at a guy who owns a exotic woods thing here in Carlsbad. And he got this board from somebody in Malibu that passed away, and his wife was in a bad way and needed some money. And this guy got this board, and I saw it the other day. And the thing about Kivlins, or the thing about boards made in that era, there are no logos. There's no markings. This board looks like a Kivlin to me. And I just say that based on, the few I've seen and the research I do online. How do we go about, stamping this board as this is a Kivlin? Like, somebody needs to step up and go, this looks like a Kivlin. Like, not only does it look like a Kivlin, it is a Kivlin. Like, I saw the board, it looks like a Kivlin. It's a Malibu chip. How many were made?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the dilemma in collecting boards is getting the provenance confirmed. Obviously, if you got a photo of the manufacturer and you talked about logos. So the trouble is back then, like I said, Kivlin wasn't working as a production manufacturer. That wasn't his goal. His goal was to make boards. And most of the ones he made were made for, personal friends or custom, clients type of thing. And also, if you ever had met Kivlin, he was a super mellow guy, really humble, wasn't a chest beater at all. And he didn't want to put his name on, the board, On the other hand, you guys like had Dewey or Velzy who were, putting a giant, this is a Weber or this is a Velzy. Kivlin was like, no, complete opposite. So it is tough. And, unless you got photographic proof or somebody who's reputable who can say, yeah, I saw this board or I knew the wife who owned it or this or that. It is tough sometimes, and you just have to go with it's, purported to be a Kivlin. We don't have complete authorization or authentication of it being, but it is believed that this is, and you have to go with a bit of, grain of salt sometimes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of guys that, you know, aren't chest thumpers, so to speak, we've got this board. It's Pete Peterson's window paddleboard. Pete Peterson, in my eyes, a very fascinating character. Here's a guy who in World War II was spending hours underwater with a welding unit, repairing, you know, naval boats and, coming up and having a ham sandwich. Like, this guy is amazing and just didn't, he was one of 100 that would do amazing stuff during World War II. And then, of course, he came home before the war. He was a 4-time Pacific Coast champion. He was a champion surfer here in California. The Pete Peterson window board. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this board?
It's interesting because when I did the Hawaiian Island Vintage Surf Auction back in the 2000s, we had a couple of Peterson boards that came through the auction, and they were some of the best paddle boards there were. And you got to realize back then, surfboards weren't very good, pre-war. So paddle boards actually were a much better buy because the boat builders were building the paddle boards, and then the surfers and the paddlers that got behind it, they really did really good quality. And Peterson was an amazing waterman and a really good paddler. So he said, hey, I'm going to build boards that can make me paddle better, because that's what he wanted to do. It was pretty neat. So he had the chops to be able to build them, and being a really good paddler, he knew what worked. So he was making these paddle boards that, were some of the best you could buy at that time, and, when things were being constructed. So I really, really like the early paddle boards. And it's kind of funny. I think the older guys that are in their 60s and 70s now, and even into their 80s, really appreciate that era, because they knew what watermen were and what paddleboarding was really part of the growth of surfing. And it was pre-foam. So you got to realize, these are made of wood, and they started finally fiberglassing them right after the war. So if you can find a really good Peterson paddleboard, I actually, kind of like them better than the Blakes, to be honest with you, because they actually worked better.
Yeah.
And, Peterson, hung out in Santa Monica there and was a lifeguard, and we all know his story behind him. And like he said, led a really colorful life. So I think if you got the space, and if you want something that really represents an era when custom built, paddle boards were happening, here's a guy that, once again, in my opinion, is in some ways better than the Blake paddleboard. So I think it's a really good representation of the era for sure.
Yeah. And this board was on display at Duke's in Malibu for decades, and also is featured in one of the first books about surfing along the California coast, The Complete Book of Surfing by Peter Dixon. So it's got plenty to back it up. I think it's a pretty cool board, and maybe
You
one
just
of the
need,
stars of the show.
yeah, you need a big wall to put it on.
Yeah, you do. Speaking of big walls, I've got and paddle boards. I've got a Velzy, 18-foot Velzy Catalina custom balsa made, recently, probably in the late 90s. And it is gorgeous, but it's probably 18 feet. Let's call it 18 feet for the sake of this conversation. But man, oh man, this one feels like, I've seen a lot of Velzys, and some of them you're like, this one feels like he got into it. He put his heart and soul into it, and it's a gorgeous balsa Catalina paddleboard. It's lightweight. It's a cool board.
Yeah, I heard a little story about that board. I thought it was closer to 20 foot, but maybe you're right at 18. You've got it there so you can measure the thing. But
Yeah.
Dick Brewer had made this balsa paddleboard under Surfboards Hawaii back in the 60s, and it was thin veneered balsa, and you actually had to blow air into the board to get the air to expand to keep the thing from contracting, because otherwise it was so thin. And I had heard that Velzy had seen that board and was inspired by the quigs and the fact that Brewer had built this Surfboards Hawaii out of balsa. I had heard that Velzy had always wanted to do one of those and kind of wanted to match and do a better one. And it took him a long time. It was later on, towards the end of his career, that he actually, built those paddle boards. But there's some really beautiful, we're talking about paddle boards here, some of those beautiful Velzy paddle boards, because, the Catalina to back to the mainland paddle race was always a big deal. Just like here in Hawaii, the Diamond Head paddle race was a big deal. So the guys that were into paddle boards were trying to get them as light as they could. And Velzy was the same thing with that balsa veneer, trying to and this is before composites, so this is really ahead of his time. And once again, if you got the space and you're into a paddleboard, I think a Velzy, just anything Velzy is pretty cool, but something like this that's very unique certainly makes it a unique piece without a doubt.
Speaking of anything Velzy is kind of cool, we've got Dale Velzy's Japanese block plane. And again, this is one of those things that I put into the auction because I just think it's friggin' cool. Like I've held it, it's just a cool thing. He got this block plane. Dale Velzy got this block plane from George Downing, came from Japan. It's got that that you get the vibe that some Japanese craftsman spent 8 months on this thing. But tell me your thoughts on Dale Velzy's 1940s Japanese block plane.
Well, this is talk about esoteric. You're getting down to the esoterics on this one, Scott. It's funny when this auction's finished. I think every guy that's got old planes in his workshop is going to be busting these out and putting them up on the market because, I mean, it's pretty neat, the story, that George gave that to Velzy and Velzy used it. And what you got to realize this is, pre, planer days when power planers came along and made life so much easier. They used to use the old adze and hatchets and, knocking these things out. And it was so much work to shape a board with hand tools. So the fact that, this is documented Velzy's block plane, I think, like I said, it's pretty esoterical, but it's kind of like if you, got some kind of a tool that Ferrari had made when he was making his cars, and it's obviously obsolete, and technology has moved beyond that. But it's just a piece of history from a time when things were handmade, and the people that made them were special people for sure.
And I've been told that this was, a tool that Velzy absolutely loved. Like it just fit his hand like a glove. I got a picture here. Bear with me. I got a picture here of Velzy. Look what he's holding.
Yeah.
That's the hand plane. And
Well,
it
that
looks
right
like,
there, the fact that you got a signed picture of Velzy, you should put that with the plane, Scott. Let that one go as well. So
oh yeah, no, this is part of the lot.
okay, that's
Yeah.
great. It's I do most of the work I do on my glass off restorations is all handwork. I hardly ever even use the planer because I'm working on boards. I never want to change the integrity of the shape. That's the whole key of restoration. You try to keep the shape as close as possible to original. And I should send you a picture of all my block planes and all my trim planes that I use, because pretty much that's all I use, that in a sure form and a couple sanding blocks. So I'm going to put my collection together and I'll send that to you for next auction.
You're carte blanche here, man. You get whatever you prefer. You're in. Um, Speaking of that, I do have a board that you worked on here, and it's a gorgeous Dewey Weber Performer, Generation 2 with the hatchet fin, and it's got a pretty incredible inlay. Tell me about this Weber Performer.
Well, as I said earlier on, I was a team rider for Dewey, and I rode for Weber through the 60s and 70s. And back in the 60s, I grew up here in Hawaii, so Surfline Hawaii was our dealer for Weber. Because of my prowess in the workroom, and then, my surfing career at that time was pretty good, I got picked to be on the Weber team. So I was really proud and I remember 15 years old, I went to California for the first time. I grew up in Hawaii. I'd never been to California. And surfing was booming. It was 1965. And I go to the Weber factory and I was blown away. I walked into the room and there's 60 racks where they were taping off just for glossing. That's when they put the competition bands and all the stripes on the boards. And I was just, here in Hawaii, we had Surfboards Hawaii and we had Inter Island Surf Shop. And that was about it. And, 2 racks in a glassing room. And here I go and there's 60 racks. I'm going, oh my God. Well, Dewey came up with the flower paisley that he actually got from the designer guy, the pop art designer. God, I can't remember his name now.
Not
Oh,
Warhol.
not Warhol, the other guy. Anyway, it'll
Yeah.
come to me.
Yeah.
So they had these dresses that were made of paper, and they were paper dresses printed with these wild fact. You realize it's the 60s, and so they started using the fabric from the paper and putting it on and laminating it on the boards. And there was an ad that came out called the Wild Webbers, 67, I think it was. And they had all this paisley. So I worked for Dewey, so I got all this original paisley,
Yeah.
this paper paisley, this laminate paper type of stuff. And I still have some left over, and I've been using it only on the Webbers. I only put it on the Webbers because that's what
Yeah.
it's for. So anyway, this board that is in the auction is, a classic Generation 2 Weber Performer with the early 𝗦𝗵𝗽𝗶𝗃 fin, and it's got the paisley deck and the colored foam T-band. I mean, Dewey made thousands of those. There was a lot of performers made, but they were the board of choice in the mid-60s, and I tried my best to replicate this as close as possible. So if you want to, get a good example of what the best-selling board of the mid-60s were, this is one for you for sure.
Yeah, man, it is gorgeous. And the blue sort of, I don't know if you call it a racing stripe or the blue stripe up there by the nose.
Yeah, that's just a nose riding comp band. So, that was really popular. A quarterback from the nose, they put the comp band, so you had a nose riding line. And, I mixed that one with the full deck paisley as well. And like I said, that's got all the bells and whistles, if you want something that's going to look flash on the wall. And you know what? I actually took that board out and surfed it. It little Sunset Point on a 1 to 2 foot dab. I finished the board. I want to see how these, used to ride. I haven't ridden one in 25 years. So
Yeah.
I went out and took it out, and it was a really fun board. It's got the super scoop on it, and, typical Weber, and it's got the hatchet fin, which the hatchet fin, I got to tell you a quick little story on that. Dewey told me the first ones were all made of fiberglass, and they were glassed onto the boards before the removable one came along. And he said, we made the hatchet fin so we could cut 2 fins out at the same time. So if you look at the little cutaway, it's the same on the top and the bottom. And that way they were able to use a fin panel. And I said, well, Dewey, what, you've written your ads about the design, about the narrow base and the wider tip. And he goes, Randy, it's all a lot of BS. It's just so they saw that square fin, they knew it was a Weber. So there you go.
That's pretty classic. And that sounds like Dewey, through and through. So interesting. Well, we've got some other stuff in here. I don't want to take too much of your time here, but I'll just finish with this one, which I find this to be perhaps the most fascinating piece in the auction. And it's a shadow box, which has it's to scale. These boards are made quarter to scale, quarter size Pat Currans that Pat Curran made. You can get 5 Pat Curran guns inside the shadow box hanging on your wall. I think this is a fascinating piece. Tell me what your thoughts are on Pat making these things down in Cabo at Rennie's place down there at 𝗥_𝗱𝗄𝗄𝗄.
I have over the years seen quite a few of those. Pat would make one, and I've sold those for as much as 5,000 for an individual one. I mean, because one is Pat Curran, 2, it's a little mini version. Anybody can have that, put it on your desk, whatever. Can't always have space for an 11-foot gun on your wall, and you spend $30,000 on a full one. So to me, I had a collector call me yesterday about this. It's interesting that you're asking me about this. He goes, how do you think those are mounted on there? Do you think you could take them off individually? And I think the guy's idea was to break up the shadow box and sell them off one by one. And he's looking at $25,000 in return on his investment. I mean, it's classic because, you get to see Pat, in his prime when he was building those. And, it's a little representation of the big real thing. So from a collector point of view, I could see that thing going for $25,000 because you got 5 of them and they're worth $5,000 each individually. So really rare. I mean, that's a unique piece, and I commend you for putting that in the auction. And I'm going to switch up away and just say that's a good piece, and anybody on a Curran, that I'd almost I'll really buy that instead of an actual board in one sense if you had the money to do either or. But Scott, I just want to commend you because you sort of took over running the California Gold Auction when I stopped doing the Hawaiian Island Vintage Surf Auction. And I tell people this all the time, the history of our sport is dictated in the boards that we are on offer. And people have no idea how hard it is to find these things, especially ones that are in really good condition. That's why I dedicate my life right now to restoring these old boards, bringing them back to life, because as a burnout, sunburned piece of junk, it doesn't have much to offer. But if you can restore it, the history of our sport is dictated in these designs that were on offer. So once again, I got to commend you for, beating the pavement, climbing in those attics, going into those houses and finding all that, because I know what's involved in making this happen. And so, for the surf collectors and even the enthusiasts, it's an opportunity to really see a window into our sport, no question about it. So I commend you on that.
Wow, thank you, Randy. I appreciate it. And of course, I lean on you heavily for your insight and guidance here. So thanks so much. One last thing, John Florence, our world champion, Hawaii's world champion. What's it like having John? And have you noticed, like, is there a big buzz on Oahu?
Oh, you should seen it. He, came home last week and they closed Cam Highway down. They had a parade. They let all the kids out of Sunset Beach Elementary, and everybody was on the side of the road cheering, and they had little posters and everything. And all up and down the North Shore, you drive along Cam Highway, there's these big signs up in people's yards, congratulations, John, 3-time world champion. Anyway, they closed the road down. Cam Highway on the North Shore had this parade. He was in the back of a pickup truck with his brothers and, waving to everybody. And the community was so stoked, and the local news guys came out, all three of the major channels here came out and covered the thing. It was a big deal. I mean, it was like the Super Bowl champions coming back to the North Shore. So a lot of pride, and it kind of reminded me back when Andy Irons won the world titles. Local pride in Hawaii is a big deal. And when the local boy does good, it's really, and John's from humble roots. He went to Sunset Elementary right across the street where all the kids came out, and he gave a nice speech, and he said, I hope I can inspire you, whether it be surfing or something else. Just follow your heart and follow your dreams and make it happen. And he says, I've done that, so it was pretty cool and everybody here was really proud, put it that way.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm proud. What a great world champion. What a great human being he is. So we're stoked for John for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I ran the Triple Crown for over 30 years, and, all the different events and this and that. And, where the WSL is going, thank goodness they're moving from trestles to Fiji, at least. I mean, the world title deserves to be run in waves of consequence, in my opinion. And I personally love to see it come back to Hawaii, and, the Pipe Masters be the title decider again. But, pro surfing is an integral part of the sport. And what's neat now is, I noticed on the auction, you've got a couple, like Kelly's boards and Andy's boards, and these are the future collectibles. I mean, they're collectible now, obviously, guys will pay good money for them. But, we're talking John Kelly and Dick Brewer and, Bob McTavish, guys from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And, now these are the guys from the 90s and the 2000s that are making their mark. And, 20, 30 years from now, it takes about 30 years for a board to become collectible. We have kind of a rule of thumb that at 30 years, it's considered collectible or vintage, I should say.
Yeah.
So, a board that Andy Irons rode in 2000 is now, a basically vintage collectible surfboard. Same with any of Kelly's boards, So it's going to be interesting moving forward, because there was such a mass production of surfboards from the 80s onwards because of shaping machines. And, every top surfer had a quiver of 30 boards. They all looked the same, and the stickers were all in the same place. So you got to find unique ones to be a future collectible. And for those out there that are interested, keep your eyes open, because there's, ones that come along every now and then.
Yeah, you're right. Look, there's a lot of boards. These guys go through a lot of boards. I think the thing is, the board that has provenance, the board that he actually, that a world title, that a world champion won a championship on that board, like that kind of thing, a board that was perhaps on the cover of Surfer magazine. These types of things moving forward are really going to set those boards apart.
Yeah.
Well, Randy, look, thanks so much for your time this morning. We've said a lot. We've covered some stuff. The auction's coming up. We're excited. The BoardRoom show honoring McTavish is coming up. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, it's always a pleasure. When it comes to surfboards, I love talking surfboards. That's my passion and my project. So call me up anytime, and I'll give you all the information I can possibly do it. And once again, for people out there listening, if they want to want to get a question from me or want to know about a board or something, just go to randyrarick.com, www.randyrarick.com. I've got a website where you can put in a question, send me pictures. Scott, I got to tell you, every day, literally every day, I get texts, phone calls, and emails from people that want to know about surfboards. And I provide the service for free. I don't charge anything. And a lot of times people send me boards and I end up restoring from them, and they become family heirlooms. So it's kind of works good for me, keeps me, me stoked. And I do about 3 boards a week. People, how long does it take, to restore a board? And I can do about 3 a week, where I get in there. I put about 5 hours a day in for 5 days a week, and work with 𝗦𝗂𝗍𝗆, Country Surfboards does my glass work. Roger Hines actually moved back here to Hawaii now. Roger's glassing some of my boards as well. So, we're really having fun bringing the little history back to life.
Well, cool. I'd love to hear that. And we'll be sending people your way. How about that?
All right, sounds good. Well, I hope to make it over for the boardroom show and see 𝗦𝗫𝗽𝗍𝗆 and yourself, and I look forward. And then good luck with the auction. I hope a lot of collectors out there find what they're looking for.
Yeah. Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it.
All right, aloha.
Aloha.